The phone vibrated against the worn leather of the dashboard, its buzz cutting through the stillness of the midnight hour. Elias Kane, a single father with calloused hands and a heart stitched together by time, froze in the driver's seat. The voice on the line was cold, metallic, stripped of warmth or preamble. "Is this Elias Kane?" it asked, not waiting for a reply. "This is internal dispatch. High priority request. VIP client needs a driver. Now. Address is in your inbox." The clock read 11:58 p.m. "It's nearly midnight," Elias said, his voice low, weathered by years of carrying burdens heavier than his truck. "Exactly," the voice replied. "That's why she called." The line went dead. Elias exhaled, his breath fogging briefly in the chilled cab. He shifted into gear, the engine's hum a quiet rebellion against the night's oppressive silence. The air outside was damp, heavy as a sodden wool coat clinging to the skin, refusing to dry. Streetlights flickered through the mist, their glow fractured into trembling halos that danced across the wet pavement. The roads were desolate, the kind of quiet that pressed against your eardrums, demanding to be felt. Elias turned into an upscale enclave, where iron gates guarded secrets and every mansion's windows glowed just enough to hint at life. Cold, distant, without warmth. Holt Manor loomed at number 72, its white stone walls gleaming under the moon like a fortress carved from bone. Wrought iron fences stood sentinel, flanked by towering hedges that whispered of secrecy rather than style. No cameras blinked, no doorbell chimed. Only a woman stood on the front steps, motionless as a statue, her tailored black suit absorbing the night. Vivian Holt, mid-30s but ageless in her severity, held herself with a spine forged in steel, her jaw clenched tight, a survivor who had learned to bury fear beneath control. Her hair was pulled into a bun so precise it seemed to defy the chaos of the world. "You're the driver," she said, not a question. "I am," Elias replied, his voice steady, meeting her gaze. "I hired you." "Yes, ma'am. Where to?" Her eyes, sharp as cut glass, held his for a moment. "Not yet," she said. "Just drive when I say. No questions, no conversation." Elias nodded, recognizing the tone, a cadence he'd heard in briefing rooms and interrogation cells, the voice of someone who had built a fortress from discipline and dared the world to breach it. Then the heavy oak door behind her creaked open, and a small figure slipped into the moonlight. Lila, no older than 6, stood barefoot, her tangled hair catching the faint glow of the porch light. In her arms she clutched a gray stuffed rabbit, Haven, its ears drooping like wilted petals, held so tightly it seemed to carry the weight of her world. Elias's heart softened, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Hey there, little one." No response. No glance, just silence, heavy and practiced, as if she'd learned to make herself invisible. "She doesn't like to be spoken to," Vivian said, her tone not cruel, just matter of fact, like stating the sky was gray. She knelt, her movements precise. "Lila, inside, bedtime." The girl turned, her small feet silent on the cold stone, and disappeared into the house. The door closed with a softness that felt wrong for a place so grand. A silence born not of peace, but of something deeper, something guarded. Elias lingered, the image of Lila's stillness searing into his chest like a quiet wound. A child that quiet wasn't shy. A child that quiet was hiding, her silence a shield against a world too heavy for her small shoulders. He climbed back into the truck, adjusted the rearview mirror, and let the engine hum, waiting. 10 minutes later, Vivian slid into the back seat, her presence as unyielding as the night itself. "Drive," she said, her voice a blade slicing through the air. "Where to?" Elias asked, keeping his tone even. "Just drive." The truck eased away from the curb, gliding through empty streets where storefronts slept and neon diner signs buzzed faintly in the fog, their colors bleeding into the mist like forgotten dreams. A soft instrumental piece drifted from the radio, strings and piano weaving a melody that felt like rain falling on a gravestone. Elias glanced in the mirror. Vivian wasn't asleep, but her eyes were fixed on the darkness beyond the window, as if searching for something she couldn't name, or was afraid to lose. "Would you like to change the music?" he offered, his voice gentle, testing the waters. "No," she replied, sharp but quiet. A pause stretched, taut as a wire, before her voice softened, barely audible, as if speaking to the night itself. If a child doesn't speak in a house full of light, maybe the darkness isn't what's to blame. Heidi, the words hung in the air, fragile as smoke curling from a dying fire, carrying a weight Elias felt in his bones. His grip tightened on the wheel, his mind flashing to his own daughter, Sophie, whose silence after her mother's death had taught him that quiet could scream louder than any cry. He hesitated, then spoke, his voice low, deliberate. Your daughter, Lila. Vivian's gaze snapped to his in the mirror, cold and unyielding, cutting him off. I'm just a driver, I know, he said, steady but soft. But I'm also a father. And I'm her mother, she countered, her words a wall. So don't interfere. Silence crashed back, heavier now, like a door slamming shut on a room with no key. At 1 a.m., the truck rolled into the valet circle of the Regent, a five-star hotel where chandeliers cast golden light across marble floors. Vivian stepped out without a word. No thank you, no good night, her silhouette disappearing into the glow like a shadow swallowed by flame. Elias lingered in the cab, his eyes drifting to the back seat where Lila had sat earlier, her small form a ghost in his memory. Something caught the light, a single gray thread from Haven's ear, delicate and frayed, lying alone on the leather. He reached back, picked it up, and rolled it between his fingers, its fragility a quiet accusation. Elias Kane, a man who had faced blood and chaos in combat zones, felt that thread weigh heavier than any battlefield. It was a relic of a child's trust, a whisper of a story that began not with a scream, but with silence, a silence that demanded someone listen. Elias Kane sat in the dim glow of his truck, the single gray thread from Haven's ear cradled between his fingers. It was fragile, barely there, yet it carried a weight heavier than the blood he'd seen in combat zones, heavier than the screams of soldiers or the wails of grieving mothers. This thread, left behind by a child too silent for her years, pressed against his heart like a stone. He didn't know Lila's story, not yet, but he felt its pulse, a quiet drumbeat of truths unspoken. Stories like hers didn't begin with cries. They were born in silence, in houses that gleamed with perfection, but hid shadows within their walls. Morning broke over Holt Manor, the same oppressive quiet greeting Elias as his truck rolled up. The iron gate parted soundlessly, as if the house itself held its breath. Vivian Holt stood waiting, her navy blazer crisp as a blade, her hair pinned with the same precision as the night before. She was neither tired nor rested, just present, a figure carved from control. 7:00 sharp, she said, glancing at her watch, her voice clipped like a metronome. I'm punctual, Elias replied, his tone steady, his eyes searching for Lila. The girl was nowhere, no shadow behind curtains, no small voice calling out. The manor loomed behind Vivian, its stillness unnatural, as if life itself had been muted. I won't need you all day, Vivian said, sliding into the back seat, her movements as deliberate as a chess move. 3 stops, conference suite on 7th, Riverside Project downtown, then the investor brunch at the Regent. Got it, Elias said, his voice a low hum, respecting her rule. No questions, no conversation. She gave a faint nod, not of approval, but of expectation, the kind you offer someone meant to obey, not understand. As the truck pulled away, Elias's gaze flicked to the manor's upper window. A shimmer of light slipped through the curtains, and for a fleeting moment, he saw it. A small face, eyes wide with unspoken stories, gone before he could blink. His hands tightened on the wheel, a silent vow forming in his chest. Hours bled into one another. Vivian moved through her meetings like a specter, her presence commanding, her glance sharp enough to silence a boardroom or shrink grown men into boys slouching in their suits. She didn't walk. She arrived, each step a declaration. She didn't listen. She assessed, her eyes dissecting every word, every gesture. Elias waited in the truck, the hum of the engine his only companion. At 1:20 p.m., Vivian returned from the brunch, her appearance flawless, save for a faint dampness on her right sleeve, as if she'd brushed against a spill or wiped away something unspoken. Tough meeting? Elias asked, his tone light but probing, like a stone tossed into still water. She didn't answer immediately, her gaze lost in the city's blur beyond the window. Then softly, as if confessing to the air, she murmured, "He called Lila a prop, said I bring her out for sympathy, like she's a marketing tactic." Elias's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting her words settle. "I should have thrown my champagne in his face," she added, her voice barely above a whisper. "You didn't?" he asked, glancing in the rear view. "No," she said, a bitter edge creeping in. "I just smiled and watched his wine glass tip over on its own." A pause hung between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Then unexpectedly she asked, "Do you have children, Mr. Kane?" The use of his name startled him, a crack in her armor. "Yes," he said, "a daughter, Sophie." "How old?" "7. Does she talk to you?" Elias's chest ached, memories of Sophie's silence after her mother's death flooding back. "She used to. Now she listens. That's her way of talking sometimes." Vivian's eyes met his in the mirror, a flicker of something raw, grief perhaps, or longing, passing through her gaze. "I don't know how to speak her language," she said, more to herself than to him. "Lila, she looks at me like I'm the moon trying to explain gravity. I feed her, dress her, give her every advantage. But the silence, it's louder than anything I say." Elias drove on, saying nothing, because some silences weren't meant to be filled. They were meant to be understood, to be held like a fragile thread until they unraveled into truth. That evening, as they returned to Holt Manor, Vivian handed him a sealed envelope, her fingers brushing the paper with deliberate care. "Bonus for yesterday and today," she said. "I like drivers who don't eavesdrop." Elias's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "I didn't say I don't hear things." Her eyes narrowed, but she repeated, "I like drivers who don't eavesdrop," before turning toward the door. Elias took a chance, his voice soft but firm. "Ms. Holt." She paused, half turning. "You ever read bedtime stories to Lila?" Her brow arched, a wall rising. "No, she reads on her own, advanced for her age." "It's not about the reading," Elias said, his words gentle but weighted. "It's about the listening that happens after the story ends." Vivian held his gaze, a heartbeat too long, then vanished into the manor's shadows without a reply. That night, sleep eluded Elias. He sat at his kitchen table, the glow of a single lamp casting long shadows across an old photo album. Pictures of Sophie at 6, her smile bright before the accident stole her mother, Mara, and her voice for a time. Back then, bedtime was a ritual of warmth, stories read under a nightlight, pages turning like promises, shadows dancing with hope. Sophie's silence hadn't been defiance. It was a wound words couldn't touch. It wasn't therapy that healed her. It was time, midnight pancakes, stories left open-ended because endings scared her. Vivian wasn't absent from Lila's life, Elias realized. She was present, but like a locked door, visible, unyielding, closed. The next morning, Vivian's call came early, her voice as crisp as the dawn. 2 errands, a shorter route. Halfway through the second drive, she asked him to wait outside a pharmacy. Elias parked, his eyes drifting to the distant outline of Holt Manor, its spires cutting through the morning mist. A flicker in the side mirror caught his attention. The back gate creaked open, and there was Lila, barefoot in oversized pajamas, clutching Haven by its frayed ears. She stood scanning the world with cautious eyes, then walked to a row of stone planters that served as a makeshift bench. She sat, hugging the rabbit, her stillness louder than any cry. Elias stepped out, moving slowly, deliberately, like approaching a deer in a clearing. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice a soft rumble. Lila didn't move, didn't flee. He sat, leaving space between them, letting silence be their bridge. Minutes passed, heavy and quiet. Then a whisper, so faint it might have been the wind. "Do rabbits get lonely too?" Elias looked at Haven, its torn ear and loose eye bearing the weight of a child's trust. "I think they do," he said, his voice warm, steady. "But sometimes they just wait for someone who remembers they're not toys." Lila nodded, slow and deliberate, her fingers tightening around the rabbit. "He used to have a name," she said, but I forgot it. That's okay, Elias replied, his tone as gentle as a lullaby. You can give him a new one. People change names all the time, even grown-ups. A pause, fragile as glass, then Layla whispered, his new name is Haven. Elias's smile was small, not flashy, but the kind that blooms when a heart softens after years of being clenched. When Vivian returned and saw Elias sitting beside Lila, her body went rigid, her eyes sharp as flint. I told you not to speak to her, she said, her voice low, taut with warning. Elias rose slowly, his movements calm but unyielding. I didn't speak, he said. I listened. He walked back to the truck, but behind him, Lila looked up, and for the first time, a flicker of a smile crossed her face. Brief, delicate, but enough to crack the silence like dawn breaking through fog. Something was growing, something small but fierce, and Elias knew he'd carry that moment like a torch in the dark. Rain began to fall just after sundown, not with thunder's drama, but with a quiet insistence, tapping against windows and seeping into the cracks of unspoken truths. Elias pulled into the curved driveway of Holt Manor, the truck's headlights cutting through the mist. Inside the foyer, Lila stood at the base of the grand staircase, barefoot, her pajama top too large, sleeves swallowing her small hands. Haven dangled from her arm, one eye missing, its gray fur damp from the air. She stared at the floor, not the window, as if it held secrets she couldn't unravel. When Vivian opened the front door, her voice was sharp, efficient. You're early, she said, brushing past. You're not, Elias replied, glancing at his watch, his tone steady but searching. He hesitated, then asked, Is Lila riding with us tonight? Vivian didn't turn. No, she said, her voice final, closing the door on the question as she disappeared inside. You're early, Vivian Holt said, her voice cutting through the rain-soaked air like a blade. Elias Kane glanced at his watch, the faint tick of its hands steady against the drizzle. You're not, he replied, his tone calm but grounded, a quiet defiance in his stillness. I'm on time. She didn't respond, her silhouette rigid against the open door of Holt Manor, before she turned and vanished inside, her steps echoing in the cavernous foyer. Elias hesitated, his gaze lingering on Lila, still standing at the base of the grand staircase. She hadn't moved, her small frame sharp with a stillness that wasn't peace but survival, as if she were willing herself to fade into the shadows. No tears stained her face, but her silence screamed louder than any sob. Is Lila riding with us tonight? He asked, his voice soft, testing the fragile space between them. No, Vivian said without turning, her words final, like a gate slamming shut. She's had a difficult day. Elias's eyes stayed on Lila, her barefoot form clutching Haven, the rabbit's frayed ears dangling like a flag of surrender. I could take her for ice cream sometime, he offered, his words careful, a lifeline tossed into the dark. Just to get out of the house. Vivian spun so sharply it was as if he'd struck a nerve, her eyes flashing with something raw, hurt, not anger. No, she snapped, her voice a wall. Okay, Elias nodded, stepping back, but he couldn't stop himself. It's just, sometimes kids talk to strangers in ways they can't with the people who love them. Vivian's gaze hardened, her voice cold as the rain. She doesn't need strangers. She needs order, stability, routine. Elias held her stare, his words soft but unyielding. Silence isn't stability, Ms. Holt. It's just the absence of sound. A flicker passed through her eyes, not anger, but something bruised, a wound she'd long buried. She's fine, she said, her voice quieter now, almost defensive. She's just quiet. She's not quiet, Elias replied, his tone gentle but piercing. She's hiding. The words hung between them, heavy as thunder, waiting to break. Vivian said nothing, her jaw tight as she turned and climbed into the back seat. Drive, she ordered, her voice a command wrapped in frost. The roads gleamed slick under the rain, neon signs and passing headlights painting fleeting murals across the windshield. Elias drove in silence, not to provoke, but because something had shifted inside him, like the rain seeping under his skin, stirring memories of Sophie's own silence after Mara's death. At a stoplight, Vivian's voice broke the quiet, low and raw. You think I'm a bad mother? Elias met her eyes in the rear view, his response steady. No, but you're thinking it, she pressed, her tone brittle. I'm thinking I've seen kids afraid to make noise, he said, and they weren't raised in quiet homes. They were raised where noise had consequences. Her reflection in the window was pale, ghostly, her voice a whisper. You don't know me. I know that when a child says nothing, Elias said, his words deliberate, it's never for nothing. Vivian's breath caught, her eyes distant. She's different, she murmured almost to herself. Always has been. Too sensitive. She didn't even cry at her first vaccine. Just looked at the doctor like she expected it. Elias stayed silent, his heart heavy. Children don't expect pain unless they've known it before, and Lila's stillness was a map of scars he couldn't yet read. Later, after her meeting, Vivian asked to be dropped at the Crescent Gallery for a charity event. Her voice clipped. Someone else will take me home. Take the rest of the night. Go home. But Elias didn't. He lingered, parked in the shadows as the gallery's lights dimmed and guests spilled into the misty night. Then he circled back to Holt Manor, parking 2 houses down, his eyes fixed on the second-floor window. Lila's room. At 10:34 p.m., a soft glow flickered on, a beacon in the dark. Elias stepped out, rain soaking his shoulders, and approached the iron gate. He didn't ring, didn't move, just stood in the downpour, trusting instinct. The front door creaked open, and there was Lila, small, unsure, Haven tucked under her chin like a talisman. She didn't speak, just opened the door wider, an invitation born of trust. Elias knelt on the doorstep, rain pooling around his knees, his voice a whisper. Hi, little one. She nodded, solemn as a vow. You okay? She held up a drawing, its lines trembling with truth. 2 houses, one with a sad face in the window, the other with no windows, just a locked door. Between them, a stick-figure girl stood alone in the rain. No one's in the house with the locked door? Elias asked gently. Lila shook her head, then pointed to herself. His breath caught, slow and heavy. You're not alone now, Lila. She didn't smile, but reached into her pocket, pulling out another drawing. Darker, heavier. A closet, a girl curled inside, and outside a faceless shape of shadows and claws. Part mother, part monster. I'm sorry, Elias whispered, his voice breaking. You didn't deserve that. Lila looked at him, truly looked, her eyes searching his for something solid. Do closets remember? She asked, her voice barely audible. Elias blinked, the question cutting deep. What do you mean? Because I don't want it to remember me. His throat tightened, the urge to pull her close overwhelming, but he held back, offering instead the words he wished someone had given Sophie. Closets don't keep memories, Lila. People do. And the people who care about you, they'll help you write better ones. She nodded, then, with trembling care, placed Haven in his hands. Keep him tonight, she said. Are you sure? He needs a break. Back in his truck, soaked and shaking, Elias cradled the rabbit like it was spun from glass. He turned on the defroster, wiped his face, and whispered to the empty cab. She gave me her shield. Now I have to be her sword. Sleep never came that night. He wrote down every word, every drawing, every quiver in her voice, because truth was fragile, and when a child dared to speak, even through crayon and paper, the world had to listen. Elias Kane was wide awake, a sentinel guarding a spark in the dark. Dawn crept through a veil of fog, casting golden threads across Elias's modest kitchen. His coffee sat cold, untouched, while Haven rested on the table, its torn seams stitched with care. Elias had worked through the night, his old sewing kit trembling in hands more used to war than mending. The rabbit wasn't just a toy, it was a message, a fragile whisper from a girl brave enough to speak without words. He lifted Haven gently, his eyes drifting to a hallway photo of Sophie, her lopsided smile frozen before the accident that stole Mara, before silence became Sophie's refuge. For 6 months after the funeral, Sophie hadn't spoken, not from inability, but from a wound too deep for words. People called it grief, said she needed time, but Elias learned grief kept its own clock, and silence didn't tick. Back then, he was still a soldier, saluting through pain, enforcing structure, meals, bedtimes, until Sophie's drawing, a stick figure by a wall, scrawled with, "Daddy is here, but not inside," broke him. That night he sat outside her door, hand on the wood, letting her feel his presence. 57 days later she spoke. "Do angels cry when no one's watching?" That was when Elias stopped being a soldier and learned to be a father. Haven stared back at him now, a patchwork of fear and hope, Lila's trust sewn into its frayed fur. He tucked it into a cloth bag and headed to his truck, the air cool, the world still waking. This wasn't just a sad child. It was a silence layered with stories, and Elias knew you didn't break silence with force. You stood beside it, patient until it invited you in. At Holt Manor, the air felt heavier, charged with unspoken tension. Vivian didn't greet him. A housekeeper he'd never seen opened the door, her eyes wary. "She's in the library," the woman said. "Not to be disturbed." Elias nodded. "Where's Lila?" "In her room, mostly," she replied, hesitating. He moved quietly toward the stairs, passing a glass hallway lined with paintings. Clinical landscapes, cityscapes, nothing human. The manor was a museum, polished but lifeless, its beauty a mask for something hollow. At Lila's door, Elias paused, the silence deafening. He knocked softly. No answer. He eased the door open a crack. Lila sat on the floor, surrounded by books she wasn't reading, her eyes fixed on them as if they held answers she couldn't find. Haven was missing from her arms because Elias held him. She glanced up, then away, as if caught daring to hope. "I brought him back," Elias said, his voice a gentle anchor, holding up the rabbit. Lila didn't move, but her eyes flickered. He knelt beside her, placing Haven in her lap. "He told me he missed you," he whispered, a soft smile in his words. "Didn't sleep much. He was worried about the girl who gave him his name." No words came, but her fingers curled around the rabbit, clutching it like a lifeline. Elias sat beside her, not pushing, not filling the silence, just there, a steady presence in a world that felt like it was holding its breath. Lila's voice, a fragile whisper, pierced the quiet. "Sometimes she cries, but not when I'm hurt. Only when I'm quiet too long." Elias Kane turned to her, his voice a steady anchor in the dim room, soft as the glow of a distant lantern. "Do you think she's scared, like you?" Lila didn't answer, her eyes fixed on the floor, but her small hand reached under the rug, pulling out a folded sheet of paper. Another drawing, its lines trembling with unspoken truths. A figure with long hair stood before a mirror, but the reflection was no woman. It was a storm, with lightning for eyes and fire for a mouth. Behind her, a girl curled in a closet, small and shadowed. Elias's breath caught, the image searing into his heart. "You think your mom turns into someone else when she's scared, don't you?" Lila nodded, slow and deliberate, then whispered, "She says I look too much like someone she can't forget." The words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through Elias's chest, stirring memories of Sophie's own silences. Her drawings that spoke when words failed. That afternoon, Elias stepped into the quiet of his truck, the weight of Lila's drawing heavy in his pocket. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years, his voice low but resolute. "Nathan," he said when the line picked up, "I need a favor. Quiet, off the record." Nathan Cole, once his brother in arms and intelligence, was sharp as a blade and loyal to the bone. "I'm listening," Nathan replied, his tone steady. "Can you pull files on Vivian Holt? Sealed cases, name changes, psychiatric history, any gaps in her record?" Nathan whistled low, the sound carrying the weight of the request. "That kind of favor." "It's not just for me," Elias said, his voice firm. "There's a kid involved, and she's starting to whisper." A beat of silence, then Nathan's promise. "You'll have something by tomorrow." Elias hung up, stepping onto the back porch of Holt Manor. Lila had followed, barefoot, clutching Haven like a talisman, her small form a silent shadow beside him. They stood together, watching the wind dance with fallen leaves in the garden, the air thick with unspoken hopes. After a long pause, Elias asked, "If you could live anywhere in the world, Lila, where would it be?" She thought for a moment, her eyes distant, then whispered, "Somewhere with quiet, but the safe kind. Elias nodded, his voice soft but certain. That's a real place. I'll find it for you, I promise. Her eyes wide and steady met his. Even if she won't let me go. He knelt, one hand over his heart, his words a vow carved in stone. I've been a soldier, Lila. I've fought through gates tougher than this, waited outside locked hearts longer than you've been alive. Yes, even if she tries to stop you, I'll find the door. For the first time, Lila reached out, her tiny hand clasping his, a silent trust that felt like the first crack of dawn after a long night. At 3:14 a.m., a storm broke without warning, a branch snapping like a gunshot outside Holt Manor. Wind howled through the trees, rain hammering the windows until the glass seemed to hum with its own pulse. The power flickered, casting the house in a ghostly half-light. Elias wasn't home. He'd taken a late-night drive, looping through the hills above the city, where the world stretched out in a paradox of everything and nothing. His phone buzzed, the housekeeper's voice frantic on the line. She fell, the woman said. Who? Elias asked, already turning the wheel, his heart pounding. Lila? I found her at the bottom of the stairs. She's not speaking. He didn't ask more, just drove, his truck slicing through the rain like a blade through fog. 15 minutes later, his boots splashed through the flooded walkway, the front door gaping too wide, an invitation to something broken. Inside, the manor felt wrong, not chaotic, but off, as if the walls themselves were pretending not to see the cracks. The housekeeper stood in the entryway, wringing her hands, her voice trembling. She's upstairs on the guest bed. Ms. Holt hasn't come out of her room. She said not to disturb her. Elias didn't respond, his steps quick and sure as he took the stairs two at a time. The guest room was dim, shadows pooling like spilled ink, but he saw Lila, still her damp hair fanned across the pillow, knees drawn to her chest, Haven tucked beneath her chin like a whispered secret. He approached, his voice a gentle tether. Lila, he whispered. Her eyes opened, wide and trembling, but no words came. Her lip quivered, faint red scrapes marking her arms, as if she'd slid against a wall. Did you fall, sweetheart? He asked, kneeling beside her. She nodded, then shook her head, her whisper barely audible, yet it stopped his heart. I was hiding. Elias's voice softened, a quiet shield. Hiding where? Her small finger tapped the nightstand once. He frowned, then rose, pulling open the closet door beside the bed. It was small, half filled with coats, but in the corner, a soft blanket lay folded into a nest, beside a flashlight, a plastic cup, a tiny stack of cookies, a hiding place, planned and deliberate. Lila, he said, turning slowly, his voice heavy with the weight of her truth. How often do you hide in here? She looked away, her whisper faint as a fading star. Only when the mirror gets too loud. Elias sank to the floor, his heart pounding like a drum in a storm. The mirror. She nodded, her eyes distant. In Mommy's room. She talks to it when she's sad or mad. Says it lies, but sometimes it says things back. He stared at her, this fragile girl wrapped around a rabbit in a truth too heavy for her small frame. Did she ever hurt you, Lila? No, she whispered, her voice breaking. Not with her hands, just with her face. The words unraveled from a place long locked, spilling like water from a cracked dam. She calls me the ghost, Lila continued. Says I float through her house like I'm not there. Says I remind her of someone who ruined everything. That's why the closet is for me. Because even ghosts need somewhere to disappear. Morning came, and Vivian emerged, her hair pristine, her suit a perfect armor, as if the storm had never touched her. You shouldn't be here, she said flatly, her eyes avoiding the guest room. It was just a fall. Elias stood between her and the door, his voice calm but unyielding. She wasn't playing. She was hiding. Vivian's expression didn't shift, but her voice grew sharp. She's imaginative, prone to dramatics. You wouldn't understand. Try me, Elias said, stepping closer. You're just the driver, she snapped, arms crossed like a shield. No, he said softly, his words cutting through her defenses. I'm the man who saw her smile for the first time in weeks. I'm the man who knows her rabbit's name. And I'm the man who found a flashlight and cookies in a closet where she hides when she's scared of you. Vivian flinched, a crack in her armor, but she recovered quickly. You think I'm a monster? I think you're drowning, Elias said, his voice low, piercing, and you're teaching your daughter to hold her breath instead of how to swim. The truth hung between them, sharp and undeniable. Vivian's jaw trembled, her mouth opening, then closing, no tears but a rawness in her eyes. She's all I have, she whispered finally. Then love her louder than the voices in your head, Elias said, his words both a plea and a challenge. She looked away, silent for the first time, her fortress crumbling under the weight of truth. That night Elias sat in his truck, rain sliding down the windshield, catching the porch light's glow like tears the house couldn't shed. He thought of Lila's closet, of Vivian talking to mirrors, calling her daughter a ghost. He reached into the glove compartment, pulling out a black notebook, its pages worn with time. Inside, a name he hadn't written in years, Mara Kane. He turned to the last page, blank for too long, and scrawled, "Today I saw a girl with your eyes, carrying storms but reaching for light. I can't walk away." He closed the book, tucking it away, then opened his phone's recorder app. Not for evidence, not yet, but to capture Lila's voice, her truth. Even ghosts need somewhere to disappear. Elias was ready to build her a home where she'd never need to hide. No closets, no mirrors, just light and the long road to being seen. Sunday dawned with a hush that felt less like peace and more like a held breath. No church bells rang, no scent of pancakes warmed the air, just gray skies and a steady drizzle that mirrored the manor's quiet grief. Elias stood alone in Lila's room, the housekeeper having taken her to the market. Vivian had said she needed space, that Lila would be fine, as if words could seal a wound. But Elias wasn't chasing endings. He was searching for beginnings, the kind hidden in places others feared to look. He crouched by the bed, pulling back the comforter, his eyes scanning the floor. A corner of paper peeked from beneath the bed frame, folded tight, weathered, tucked where no curious hand would find it. He reached for it, unfolding two drawings. The first was a house, not the storybook kind, but crooked, its windows scribbled black with crayon. 3 stick figures stood outside, a tall one, a small one, and a third with no face. Above them, in uneven letters, a warning. Don't tell, or she'll take him. Elias's hand tightened, his pulse quickening. The second drawing was worse. Lila alone in a box, no doors, no windows, just her curled tight beside Haven, a silent cry etched in crayon. Elias Kane sat back on his heels, his breath shallow, the weight of Lila's drawings pressing against his chest like a cold stone. No doors, no windows, just a girl curled beside a headless rabbit, Haven in a box of crayon and fear. Above it, in stark, trembling capitals, a single word. Sorry. These weren't mere sketches. They were confessions, etched by a child too afraid to speak in daylight, her truths whispered through crayon strokes. Elias folded the pages with care, slipping them into the inner pocket of his coat, where they rested like a vow. As he stood, his eyes caught something else, a faint scratch on the underside of the bed frame, barely visible, carved with a pencil or key. I hear her. 3 words, a fragile rebellion against silence, etched where no one was meant to look. They burned in his mind, a call to action, a child's plea for someone to listen. Later that day, Elias met Nathan Cole in the deserted parking lot of an old warehouse just outside town. Nathan, a former intelligence operative with eyes that saw through lies, leaned against his battered Jeep, flipping through a thin folder. "You were right to be suspicious," he said, his voice low, steady. "Vivian Holt wasn't always Vivian Holt." Elias crossed his arms, his jaw tight. "How far back does it go?" "She was born Vivian Grace Porter," Nathan replied, handing over the folder. "Changed her name at 21. No father on record. Mother institutionalized twice. Minor records sealed for psychiatric evaluation. No formal charges." He held up a grainy black and white scan of a hospital file, a younger Vivian staring out, pale, hollow-eyed, wrists wrapped in bandages, a girl pieced together from broken glass, pretending to be unbreakable. Social worker noted emotional dissociation, repeated trauma, self-harm history. Nathan continued, his tone quiet but heavy. She vanished from public records for 3 years, then resurfaced as the youngest VP at a hedge fund in San Diego. Elias flipped through the pages, each one a fragment of a woman who'd traded healing for success. She never got treatment, Nathan said softly. Just power, and that's not the same thing. Elias nodded, his mind racing, then asked, "What about Lila's father?" Nathan hesitated, his eyes darkening. "That's the other piece. No birth certificate, no paternity claim, no court record, just one clinic note mentioning a male visitor once during Vivian's pregnancy. No name, just this." He handed Elias a single sheet, the words scrawled in shaky penmanship. "Patient refuses to discuss child's conception. States, she's not his, she's mine, entirely mine." Elias exhaled, the words settling like lead in his chest. This wasn't just about a child living in fear. It was about a woman haunted by ghosts she'd passed down like an heirloom, each one heavier than the last. That evening, Vivian hosted a dinner at Holt Manor, a spectacle of white tablecloths, polished silver, and crystal glasses that chimed like fragile warnings with every breath. Lila sat at the table, her feet barely grazing the floor, Haven tucked against her side like a shield against the world. Elias, strangely invited, stood out in his simple jacket, a guest for show, as Vivian had said with a forced smile. "You clean up well," she remarked, her voice tight, deflecting. "And you deflect well," Elias replied, his tone calm but pointed. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing. "Must we always spar?" "Only if you keep pretending silence is peace," he said, his words a quiet challenge. No answer came. At the table, Lila was silent, her fork pushing food in circles, as if it might turn on her. Then Vivian leaned close, her voice low, cutting through the room's fragile elegance. "You know, Lila, when I was your age, I didn't get stuffed animals. I got silence, and silence taught me how to survive." The words froze the air, forks halting, glasses clinking. Lila didn't respond, her eyes fixed on her plate, but Elias couldn't stay silent. "You're not supposed to teach a child how to survive you," he said, his voice calm but piercing. "You're supposed to make sure she never needs to." A single breath escaped a guest's lips, the room holding its breath. Vivian's expression didn't shift, but her hands curled in her lap, knuckles white, betraying the storm beneath her polished surface. That night, a soft knock came at Elias's door. He opened it to find Lila, Haven in her arms, her eyes wide but steady, carrying a courage too big for her small frame. She held out a drawing, different this time. 2 figures under an open sky, a small one clutching a rabbit, a taller one kneeling beside her. No house, no shadows, just light. At the bottom in blocky letters, 3 words. He stayed anyway. Elias dropped to one knee, meeting her gaze. "I'll always stay," he said, his voice a vow, rough with truth. "Even when it's hard, even when it hurts, especially then." Lila blinked, a question trembling on her lips. "Does Haven believe that?" Elias reached out, touching the rabbit gently, his smile soft but sure. "I think Haven's starting to." She nodded, slipping the drawing into his coat pocket, then turned to go. Before she vanished down the hall, her whisper floated back, so faint it nearly dissolved in the air. "I hear you too." Elias stood frozen, hand over his heart, the drawing a burning weight in his pocket. A child's trust was a fragile flame, and now that Lila had given him hers, he guarded it like breath, like fire, like life itself. The next morning, the sky was a smear of gray, no sunrise, just a horizon that had forgotten how to glow. Elias stood at the edge of Holt Manor's garden, hands in his pockets, watching Lila move among the apple trees. She wasn't playing, not truly, just tracing the same path, dragging Haven by one ear, her eyes searching the ground for something only she could see. He didn't call out, didn't interrupt. Some griefs needed space but not solitude, and he stood close enough to keep her from feeling alone. A voice broke the silence behind him. "You think I hate her?" Vivian stood barefoot on the stone steps, her silk robe untied, loose strands of hair framing a face that was less CEO and more ghost. Elias didn't turn. "I don't think you hate her," he said softly. "I think you're afraid of her." She scoffed, sharp and brittle. "Afraid of a child?" "No," he replied, his voice steady. "Afraid of what she reminds you of." Silence stretched, heavy as the mist. Vivian descended the steps, her movement slow, as if the robe carried the weight of her past. "Last night," she said, her voice cracking, "I sat in front of the mirror for 2 hours, waiting for her face to stop looking like mine." Elias turned now, meeting her gaze. "She doesn't look like you." "Yes, she does," Vivian insisted, her voice brittle as thin ice. "She has my eyes, my silence, my echoes." She sank onto a garden bench, her eyes lifting to his, raw and unshielded. "Do you know how Lila was born?" Elias stayed silent, letting her words unfold. "She wasn't wanted," Vivian said, the confession sharp as glass. "She was survival, a consequence, a scar that grew legs." Elias shook his head, his voice firm. "I don't believe that. Not for a second." Her laugh was dry, cutting. "I spent the first 6 months after she was born terrified I'd drop her, feed her too much or not enough. I Googled how to love your baby at 2 a.m. Elias's voice softened, a quiet bridge. "Did it help?" "No," she whispered, "because love isn't a skill. It's a scar you choose to keep open." He sat beside her, the bench cold beneath them. "Not close," he said. "Just enough." "She doesn't need perfect," Elias added, his words steady. "She needs real." Vivian's voice broke, barely audible. "I'm not real. I'm a shell, built from ruins, trauma, and expensive fabrics. You think you're helping Lila by staying? You're just showing her what she's missing." Elias shook his head, his gaze unwavering. "No, you're missing someone who doesn't walk away." Vivian blinked, her voice trembling for the first time, a crack in the fortress she'd built. "I wasn't always like this, you know," Vivian Holt whispered, her voice fragile as a cracked porcelain cup. "I used to sing, scribble poetry in the margins of textbooks, before my mother made me scrub blood from the bathroom floor and threatened to lock me outside if I cried again." Elias Kane's chest tightened, a familiar ache from years of carrying his own scars. "You were a little girl, Vivian," he said, his voice steady, grounding. "No," she murmured, her eyes distant, haunted. "I was a warning, and now I'm passing that warning to her." Elias turned, his gaze unwavering, his words a quiet command. "Then stop. Be the one to break it. The inheritance." Silence stretched, heavy with the weight of her past. Vivian's eyes met his, raw and trembling, her voice barely a breath. "I don't know how to be gentle." Elias leaned closer, his voice rough with truth. "Then let someone else show her until you learn." They sat on the garden bench, minutes stretching into years, the silence not cold but ancient, yearning for forgiveness. Finally, Vivian stood, her silk robe catching the breeze like a ghost stirring. "I'll be gone a few days," she said, her voice steadier now. "Business, real or not, it doesn't matter. She's safer when I'm not here." Elias rose, his resolve firm. "I'll stay with Lila." "I know," Vivian said, and as she turned to leave, Elias asked, "Who did she mean? The someone she reminds you of?" Vivian didn't stop, but her voice drifted back across the stones, fragile as a whisper, learning to speak. "Me." That night, Lila fell asleep on the couch, her small head resting in Elias's lap, her breath soft and even. A storybook lay open beside them, stalled on page 3, its pages glowing faintly under the lamplight. Earlier she'd asked, "Why does the bunny in the book always come back?" Elias had smiled, his heart softening. "Because sometimes what's lost doesn't want to stay gone." Now Haven was tucked against her heart, a quiet sentinel, and Elias didn't move, didn't dare, knowing this fragile trust could shatter with a single wrong breath. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a message from Nathan Cole. Found something else. Vivian's mother, dead in an Arizona facility, self-inflicted. Vivian found her, age 17. No one came for her after. Elias stared at the screen, then down at Lila's hand, her fingers twitching toward his in sleep. "But someone came for you," he whispered, his voice a vow in the dark. The clock ticked softly in the hall, and though the war wasn't over, the tide was turning, not with shouts or battles, but with presence, with being the one who stays when others find reasons to leave. Tomorrow he'd tell Lila what she already felt in her bones. Sometimes you're not the echo, but the start of a new song. Monday dawned without fanfare, the sky still weeping its quiet drizzle, as if Holt Manor itself had learned to cry in silence. In his garage, Elias opened a padded black case, his movements deliberate, reverent. Inside, nestled in foam, lay a micro camera the size of a button, a motion-triggered recording chip, and a charger disguised as a child's nightlight. Nathan had delivered it that morning, his only words a quiet warning. "This is for when silence isn't enough." Elias lifted the final piece. Haven, the gray rabbit, its belly newly stitched, a tiny device hidden behind its cotton heart. It would capture voices, tones, truths, not just for courts, but for the kind of justice that listens when children speak. Because sometimes files are believed more than small voices. That evening, as Vivian left for her business trip, she didn't hug Lila or say goodbye. She tapped her phone, barked orders to the housekeeper, and vanished into a black town car, her absence a shadow that lingered. Lila stood by the front door for a full minute, motionless, her eyes unreadable, waiting for something that never came. Elias crouched beside her, his voice gentle as a lullaby. "She didn't forget you." Lila turned, her gaze wide but guarded. "She never forgets me," she whispered. "She just remembers that I remind her." Elias didn't reply immediately, reaching instead into his tote bag, pulling out Haven wrapped in tissue paper, reborn but watchful. "He wanted you to have him back," he said, handing her the rabbit. Lila's fingers curled around the soft fur, her eyes tracing its stitches. "He looks better." "Same heart," Elias said, his smile warm. "Just a few new stitches." Her voice dropped, almost too soft to hear. "Will he protect me?" Elias didn't blink, his words a promise carved in stone. "He already is." That night the manor was almost still, its silence a held breath. Elias waited until Lila slept, her hand curled around Haven like a lifeline, then slipped from her room. In his truck, he opened his laptop, syncing the audio feed. The screen lit up, a waveform dancing, quiet then sharp. Voices emerged, Vivian's, brittle and cold. "How many times do I have to tell you not to hum? Humming is for babies, Lila." Lila's voice, faint, trembling. "I didn't mean to." Vivian again, sharp as a blade. "Your meaning doesn't matter. Only your silence does." A click, a glass or brush set down hard. Footsteps, a door. Then silence, colder than the rain outside. Elias sat, fists clenched, jaw tight, not from shock but recognition. He'd heard that tone in boot camps, in interrogation rooms, a coldness that didn't thaw. The next morning, Elias drove Lila to school, the quiet between them soft, not heavy. Before she stepped out, she handed him a small folded drawing. It was different. A tall tree, a swing, two figures beneath, one small, one taller, hands dark with lines like gloves, or perhaps warmth. Above, in uneven letters, "If I fall, he catches." Elias tucked it into his coat, his voice steady. "You did good, Lila. Real brave." She looked up, her eyes searching. "What happens when she comes back?" He paused, then answered, slow and certain. "This time, we'll be ready." That night, he reviewed more recordings, fragments of pain woven into words. "Why do you always look at me like I'm not enough? Draw your little ghosts. They're your only friends. Don't act scared of me. You came from me. You are me." Then a clip, barely 20 seconds, changed everything. Vivian's voice, low and commanding. "If anyone asks about those bruises again, you say you fell. Do you hear me?" Lila's voice trembling. "Yes, Vivian." "Good girl, now fix your face." Elias froze, his heart a drumbeat of resolve. He grabbed his phone. Nathan answered on the first ring. You've got something. I've got everything, Elias said, his voice steel, and I'm not waiting anymore. The next morning, Lila stood by the window, backpack slung over one shoulder, Haven in her arm. But this time, her gaze wasn't fearful. She watched the driveway, waiting for him. When Elias arrived, she opened the door herself. No hesitation, no coaxing. I'm ready, she said, her voice small but firm. He smiled, crouching to her level. Are you sure? She nodded, her eyes steady. You said Haven was protecting me, but now I want to protect him too. Elias held out his hand, and she took it, a quiet act louder than any verdict. The tide had turned, not with court orders or signatures, but with choice. Lila wasn't just surviving. She was choosing to stand, to trust, to speak, even when the world seemed deaf. Elias was no longer just her driver. He was her witness, her wall, her lighthouse in the fog. Soon the world would hear her, not through screams but through truth, carried by a small gray rabbit that never stopped listening. Nathan Cole's voice came through the phone, steady but heavy with unspoken gravity. It's enough to open the door, but not enough to close it. Elias Kane paced his living room, the floorboards creaking under his boots, his thumb tracing the edge of Lila's latest drawing, now pinned beside Sophie's faded school picture on the fridge, a small shrine to the children who'd taught him how to listen. So what do we do? He asked, his voice low, taut with purpose. Wait, Nathan replied, unflinching. Gather more. Build the case like a staircase, one step at a time, and in the meantime, you keep her safe, even if it breaks you. Elias hung up, standing in the quiet, the weight of Nathan's words settling like dust after a storm. Outside, streetlights flickered to life, casting amber pools across the sidewalk, their glow a fragile defiance against the dark. In the next room, Lila lay curled on the couch, Haven pressed to her chest, her stillness not sleep but survival. Elias knew that silence wasn't just fear, it was a language she'd learned to speak fluently, a shield against a world too heavy for her small shoulders. He knelt beside her, his voice soft as a prayer. I'm going to tell you something, Lila. You don't have to answer, just listen. Her eyes, wide and focused, turned to him, carrying a courage that belied her years. When I was your age, I didn't cry either. Not because I wasn't sad, but because I thought no one would hear me. Lila blinked, her lip quivering. Sometimes, Elias continued, his words steady, we carry the pain of people who never learned to let theirs go. They don't mean to pass it on, but it lands on you, like a coat 2 sizes too big, weighing you down. Lila's voice, barely a whisper, broke the quiet. Is that what she's wearing? My mom? Elias nodded, his heart aching. She's wearing her mother's pain, and it's tearing her apart from the inside. Then why doesn't she take it off? Lila asked, her voice trembling with a child's logic. Elias paused, then spoke the truth, hard but clear. Because some people are more afraid of freedom than pain. Pain feels familiar. Lila clutched Haven tighter, her eyes dropping to the rabbit. I don't want her coat, she said, her voice small but fierce. I know, Elias whispered, his words a promise. That's why you're the one who'll end this. The next morning, Elias sat across from Vivian Holt in her pristine office, its sterile elegance a stark contrast to the storm in Lila's drawings. Vivian, back from her trip, was armored again, hair immaculate, lipstick flawless, her composure a fortress. He'd requested a private meeting, and she'd agreed, her voice cool as she leaned back in her chair. Let's not waste time. This is about Lila, I assume. Elias met her gaze, unflinching. It's always been about Lila. You just keep making it about you. Her eyes narrowed, but she stayed silent, a crack in her armor. I'm not here to accuse or fight, Elias said, his voice calm but piercing. I'm here to tell you the truth you've been running from. Vivian tilted her head, her expression guarded. Which is? That the little girl in your house isn't your past. She's not your echo. She's my daughter, Vivian snapped, her voice sharp but brittle. No, Elias said softly. She's a child with her own story, her own voice, her own scars, and you're rewriting them with your ink. Silence stretched, taut as a wire. I know what happened to you, he added, his tone gentler now. I've read the reports. Talk to people who remember. Vivian's mouth opened, then closed, her composure faltering. You were a child too, Elias continued, leaning forward. But no one stepped in. No one broke the pattern. I'm doing that now. Her voice cracked, raw and exposed. She doesn't want me. She flinches, hides, looks at me like I'm the monster under her bed. Elias didn't waver. Then be the mother who drags that monster into the light and shows her its fear, not you. Vivian's breath trembled, and she asked, her voice barely audible, do you think I can still learn to love? Elias didn't answer with words. He stood, crossed to the window and opened it, letting crisp, uncontrolled air flood the room. Learning to love doesn't start with her, he said, turning back. It starts with forgiving yourself. That afternoon, Lila asked to sleep in the guest room. Why? Elias asked gently, kneeling beside her. It feels safer, she whispered. Less memories. He nodded, a quiet resolve in his eyes. Then let's make new ones. Together they chose a nightlight, its soft yellow glow shaped like a small moon, and bed sheets patterned with constellations, a sky of possibilities. That evening, as Elias tucked her in, Lila's voice was soft, searching. Does starting over mean forgetting? No, he said, his voice warm, steady. It means remembering differently. She chewed on that, then asked, if I get brave tomorrow and talk to someone, will it help other kids too? Elias's chest swelled, a quiet pride in her courage. It might, Lila. It just might change everything. The next morning, Nathan delivered the final piece, a time-stamped video from Haven's hidden camera. Vivian, unraveling on the edge of Lila's bed, her voice a broken whisper through clenched teeth. I'm sorry. I don't know how to be soft. I only know how to survive, and I don't want you to learn that from me. Elias watched the clip twice, not to judge but to see her, the mother behind the scars, flawed but not absent, fighting her own ghosts. He sent the footage to Child Services with a note. There is harm here, but also hope. Proceed with wisdom. That evening, Vivian returned to Holt Manor and found Lila at the kitchen table drawing. The girl looked up, her gaze steady, and said, Mom. Vivian froze, her armor cracking. Lila reached for Haven, her voice quiet but resolute. I want to believe you can change. Vivian dropped to her knees, her whisper raw. I don't know how long it'll take, but I'll stay until it happens. Elias watched from the doorway, and for the first time in weeks, no one flinched. No one hid. Silence became a space to grow, not a cage to escape. Breaking the cycle wasn't about erasing the past. It was about rewriting the future with one voice, one child, and one person brave enough to stay through the pain. The days that followed unfolded like a sunrise, slow and cautious, but undeniably brighter. Lila began to hum, soft, fleeting melodies under her breath as she brushed her hair or swung her feet at the breakfast table, testing the air for safety. It was safe. Vivian didn't scold, didn't turn away. She listened, her eyes softening. One morning she hummed back, off-key, not quite a song, but a fragile thread of connection. Lila, with her brave little heart, took it, weaving it into her own melody. By Thursday, Elias noticed a shift in Vivian, not in her polished suits or measured steps, but in her pauses. She lingered before speaking, her voice softer, as if learning to breathe through pain instead of letting it speak for her. It was subtle, but it was a beginning, a crack in the fortress, letting light seep through. One night, as Lila slept with Haven tucked into the curve of her neck, her breath soft and even, Vivian Holt approached Elias Kane in the shadowed hallway of Holt Manor. Her voice was a whisper, fragile as a leaf caught in the wind. I found something, she said, her eyes flickering with a vulnerability Elias hadn't seen before. In my mother's things, after she died. Elias nodded, his presence steady, letting her lead. They moved to her study, a room of polished wood and muted light, where Vivian pulled a weathered envelope from a drawer, its edges yellowed, unopened. I never had the courage to read it, she admitted, her voice trembling. Not until today. She handed it to him, her fingers hesitant, as if the paper might burn. Elias unfolded the letter with care, its looping cursive smudged in places, as if tears had fallen as it was written. Evelyn, I don't know if this will reach you. I've made more mistakes than I can count. Taught you more fear than love. I don't expect forgiveness, but I hope with all I have left that you break this curse. You don't have to become me. There's a softness in you. I saw it once, when you held your breath to save a bird fallen from the window. Let that part grow, even if it hurts, especially when it hurts. Love, Mom. Elias looked up, his eyes glassy, the words sinking into his chest like a stone. Vivian's face was unreadable, but her voice cracked, raw and unguarded. I hated her for years, and all this time, she was begging me not to become her. Elias set the letter down, his voice steady but heavy. Pain passed down becomes a legacy. Pain faced becomes healing. Vivian sat across from him, silent for a long moment, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Do you think I've done too much? Hurt Lila too deeply? Elias shook his head, his words deliberate. Wounds like hers don't heal quickly, but they remember who stayed. That weekend, Lila had a visitor. Not Vivian's idea, but Lila's own. My kindergarten teacher, she explained, her voice brighter than Elias had ever heard. Miss Adele, who kept extra crayons for me, even the sparkly ones. Vivian made the call, her fingers trembling as she dialed. Miss Adele arrived just before noon, her silver hair catching the light, her smile warm as forgiveness itself. Lila didn't hesitate. She ran to her, not hiding, not watching from the shadows, but running, her small arms open. The teacher knelt, enveloping her in a hug. You've grown, Miss Adele said, her voice thick with emotion. Lila beamed, her eyes alight. And I've learned to sleep with both eyes closed now. Miss Adele's eyes shimmered with tears. That's the bravest thing I've ever heard. Vivian stood in the corner, her gaze uncertain, caught between shame and hope. Miss Adele turned to her, her voice gentle but piercing. I don't know what's happened here, but children don't hum again unless someone's been listening. Vivian opened her mouth, but no words came. She nodded, a gesture not of pride but of humility, a quiet surrender to the truth. That night, under the soft glow of string lights Lila had insisted they hang together, Elias and Vivian sat on the back porch, sipping tea as the wind whispered through the garden. I'm not asking for anything, Vivian said, her voice soft, unguarded. Not praise, not permission, not even peace. I just want to be present. Elias looked at her, really looked, his eyes tracing the lines of a woman learning to rebuild. Healing doesn't always look like progress, he said. Sometimes it's just staying at the table when every instinct screams to run. Vivian met his gaze, her voice steady but raw. And sometimes it's handing someone the letter you were too afraid to read alone. Silence settled, broken only by the wind and Lila's faint laughter drifting from an open window, a sound like sunlight breaking through clouds. Later, Lila called out softly from her room. Elias entered, finding her wide awake, Haven in one arm, her other hand fidgeting with her pillow's edge. Can I tell you something? She asked, her voice small but clear. Anything, Elias said, kneeling beside her. I'm not scared of bedtime anymore. He smiled, his heart swelling. Why not? Because when the dark comes, I don't feel alone in it anymore, she said, yawning sleepily. You and Haven are louder than the quiet now. Elias kissed her forehead, his touch gentle as a promise. Then Lila said something that unraveled him entirely. I don't know what love sounds like, but I think it might sound like staying. He didn't speak, just sat there, one hand on her back, the other over his heart, holding in a flood of emotions, too vast for words. Down the hall, Vivian opened her journal, the pages crisp and unyielding. On a fresh one, she wrote, Tonight my daughter laughed in her sleep. That's the sound of a cycle breaking, not with shouting or violence, but with presence, tea on porches, and a bunny with a stitched heart. I am not my mother, but I am her lesson. And maybe, just maybe, I'm ready to pass on something better. She closed the book, exhaled, and for the first time since Lila's birth, tomorrow didn't feel like a battle to survive. It felt like a day to begin. The morning of the court hearing dawned colder than expected, the sky a blank canvas of gray, no sun, no bird song, just a silence that amplified every breath. Lila held Elias's hand tightly as they climbed the courthouse steps, Haven tucked under her arm like a steadfast sentinel. Vivian walked a few steps behind, not out of obligation, but choice. Her low heels and simple navy coat a quiet departure from her usual armor, her hair pulled back in a soft ponytail. They were three souls stepping toward an uncertain future, but something had shifted. A battle had become a bridge. Inside the courtroom was a hall of mirrors, reflecting every mistake, every triumph, every scar. Elias testified first, his voice steady, though his hands trembled as he held up Lila's drawings. "Vivian's not evil," he said, his words measured but compassionate. "She's injured, but she's showing up. Sometimes that's where everything begins." Vivian stood next, unfolding a letter she'd written, her voice trembling but clear. "I wasn't taught to mother. I was taught to endure, raised on silence and survival. For too long I passed that on because I didn't know better. But I've seen love now. It's a man who stayed when he didn't have to, a child who reaches out despite being pushed away, a bunny stitched together because broken things are worth saving. I'm not asking to win. I'm asking to try, to become the mother Leela deserves, and maybe one day, the one she's proud of." The courtroom fell still, the air heavy with the weight of her words. The judge leaned back, as if the room itself had shifted. Lila went last, standing on a step stool, her small hands gripping the wooden railing. The judge leaned in, gentle. "Is there anything you'd like to say, sweetheart?" Lila glanced at Elias, then Vivian, her voice clear with a child's unyielding truth. "I want to live with both of them. One knows how to listen, and the other's learning." The judge smiled softly, and with that, the decision was made. Joint guardianship, counseling, a family plan. Not perfect, but brimming with possibility, where hope could take root. 3 weeks later, spring crept into Holt Manor's garden, soft buds unfurling, breezes carrying the promise of renewal. Lila, barefoot in the grass, chased bubbles Elias blew from the porch, her giggles a melody that filled the air for the first time in years. Haven flew from her arm like a flag of joy. Vivian watched watering daffodils, her hands, once known for firm handshakes and precise keystrokes, now learning the gentle art of nurturing. "Do you ever think," she asked Elias as he stood beside her, "that the hardest part of love isn't giving it, but believing we deserve it?" Elias glanced at Lila, still spinning in the yard. "No," he said, his voice warm. "The hardest part is staying long enough to see it grow." Vivian's eyes softened. "Thank God you did." He didn't reply, just handed her the bubble wand. "Your turn." She raised a brow. "I don't do bubbles." "Neither did I," Elias said, smiling, "until someone reminded me what it's like to laugh without fear." Vivian dipped the wand, blowing a single shimmering bubble that floated skyward, fragile but radiant. Lila chased it, caught it, and whispered, "I'll name this one tomorrow." That evening, Lila curled up in bed between them, a weekend ritual they'd begun. Haven rested between her and Vivian, a silent bridge. "Do you know what I wished for today?" Lila murmured, her voice sleepy. "What?" Elias asked. "That nothing goes back to how it was before, even if we mess up sometimes." Vivian leaned in, her voice soft. "We will mess up, but now we clean it up together." Elias added, "That's family. Not never hurting, but never walking away." Lila yawned, her words a quiet vow. "Good, I'm keeping you both." The night settled around them, warm and honest, a home built on presence. Months later, at Lila's school spring showcase, parents gathered to see their children's work. As Lila stepped onto the stage to read her story, Vivian gripped Elias's hand, her hold tighter than intended. Lila took the microphone, her voice clear and bright. "This is about a bunny named Haven, who thought he was just a toy, but he learned he was the heart of a new beginning, because love doesn't have to be perfect, it just has to stay." The room erupted in applause, tears glistening in Elias's eyes, in Vivian's too. Lila smiled, whiter than the sun, knowing at last what love sounded like. Two chairs always at the table, someone humming back, the quiet strength of staying. It sounded like home.